She can barely carry her own pack. How's she gonna handle real patrol duty? The laughter rippled through the mess hall as Corporal Hayes slammed his tray down, pointing toward the corner table where a lone figure sat eating in silence. I'm telling you, sending Rodriguez out there is gonna get someone killed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The scorching heat of Camp Resolute bore down on the remote outpost in eastern Afghanistan, where dust devils danced across the perimeter and the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels against the blazing sky. It was here, in this forgotten corner of Kandahar province, that Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez found herself once again defending her right to exist in a world that had already decided she didn't belong. At 26 years old, Maria stood exactly 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair that she kept meticulously braided according to regulations. Her frame was lean, almost delicate by military standards, weighing in at barely 130 pounds soaking wet. Every morning she laced up boots that seemed too large for her feet, strapped on gear that dwarfed her torso, and faced another day of skeptical glances and whispered doubts from her fellow Marines. The forward operating base housed 250 personnel, a mixture of Marines, Army Rangers, and Navy SEALs conducting counterinsurgency operations in one of the most dangerous regions of the war zone. Camp Resolute had earned its reputation through blood and sacrifice, with casualty rates that made even the most hardened veterans check their gear twice before heading outside the wire. This wasn't a place for the weak, the unprepared, or the unlucky. Maria had arrived at the base 3 weeks earlier, transferred from a logistics unit in Kabul after repeatedly requesting combat assignment. Her personnel file read like a textbook example of military efficiency. Perfect scores on written examinations, flawless performance in non-combat roles, and commendations for administrative excellence. But none of that mattered here, where survival depended on variables that couldn't be measured in a classroom. The mess hall conversation that evening had started innocuously enough, with patrol assignments being discussed over lukewarm coffee and reconstituted meals that tasted like cardboard. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had announced the weekly rotation, and Maria's name appeared on the list for the first time since her arrival. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. "No disrespect to Rodriguez," said Sergeant First Class Williams, a mountain of a man from Alabama who had completed 4 tours in Iraq before volunteering for Afghanistan duty. "But we're talking about 12-hour patrols through Taliban territory. When the shooting starts, she's going to be a liability, not an asset." The conversation gained momentum as more voices joined in, each adding their own assessment of Maria's supposed shortcomings. They discussed her size, her apparent lack of combat experience, her quiet demeanor that they mistook for weakness. None of them noticed how she continued eating methodically, her dark eyes absorbing every word, cataloging every assumption, filing away each dismissive comment for future reference. Corporal Davis, fresh from boot camp and eager to prove himself among the veterans, decided to escalate the discussion. "I heard she requested combat duty specifically. Like, who does that? Most people are trying to get out of the field, not into it. Something's not right about that." The speculation grew more elaborate with each passing minute. Maybe she was running from something back home. Maybe she had connections in the brass. Maybe she was just delusional about her own capabilities. The theories multiplied, but none of them came close to the truth that Maria carried like a locked vault in her chest. Master Sergeant Thompson, the grizzled platoon leader who had survived 3 IED explosions and earned 2 Purple Hearts, finally stepped into the conversation. At 6 feet 2 inches and 240 pounds of solid muscle, he commanded respect through presence alone. "Look, people," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife through fabric. "Rodriguez passed all the same tests you did. She qualified on the same weapons, completed the same training. If command says she's ready for patrol, then she's ready for patrol. But even Thompson's words carried an undertone of uncertainty. He had reviewed her file personally, searching for the combat experience that surely must exist somewhere in her background. Instead, he found 2 years of logistics work, followed by a brief stint in medical support, then a transfer to communications. On paper, Maria Rodriguez looked like someone who had spent her entire military career avoiding the very dangers she was now volunteering to face. The truth was far more complicated, buried beneath layers of classified reports and sealed records that would never see the light of day. Maria's official service history omitted certain deployments, certain operations, certain nights when she had returned to base covered in dust and blood that wasn't her own. The Pentagon had rules about disclosure, about operational security, about protecting assets who had served in capacities that officially didn't exist. As the mess hall slowly emptied that evening, Maria remained at her corner table, methodically cleaning her tray and organizing her belongings with the precision of someone who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She was aware of the conversations happening around her, conscious of the doubt and skepticism, but none of it surprised her anymore. Hayes lingered near the exit, unable to resist one final comment. "Hey, Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying across the nearly empty hall. "Just so you know, when we're out there tomorrow and things go sideways, don't expect anyone to carry your gear for you. We all got our own problems to worry about." Maria looked up from her tray, meeting his gaze, with calm, steady eyes that revealed nothing of what lay beneath the surface. "Understood," she replied simply, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. Hayes and the others couldn't see was the way Maria's hands remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline that should have been coursing through her system. They couldn't detect the subtle shift in her posture that indicated a readiness for action, the unconscious evaluation of exits and potential weapons that had become second nature through years of training. They would never know about that night. As Maria lay in her narrow bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of a military base, settling into evening routine, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Tomorrow would bring the first real test of her cover, the first opportunity to prove herself in the eyes of her new unit. But it wouldn't be the first time she had faced such a challenge, wouldn't be the first time she had been underestimated because of her size and appearance. The mountain wind whistled through the compound, carrying with it the distant sound of helicopters returning from night missions and the occasional crack of sniper fire from the perimeter. Maria closed her eyes and began the breathing exercises that had sustained her through situations far more dangerous than anything Camp Resolute could offer. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it the chance to show these Marines what they had failed to recognize sitting in their midst, in the darkness of the barracks. She whispered a prayer for the men who would accompany her on patrol, unaware that their greatest asset was the small, quiet woman they had already written off as their weakest link. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at 0430, jolting the barracks to life with the mechanical precision that defined military existence. Maria Rodriguez was already awake, had been for the past hour, lying motionless on her narrow cot while her mind ran through equipment checks and tactical scenarios. Around her, the sounds of awakening Marines filled the space, groaning, cursing, the rustle of sleeping bags being kicked aside with reluctant resignation. She slipped from her bunk silently, feet hitting the cold concrete floor without a sound. While others stumbled toward the latrines half-blind with sleep, Maria moved with the fluid efficiency of someone whose internal clock had been permanently reset by years of unpredictable schedules and sudden deployments. Her personal effects occupied exactly the regulation amount of space, toiletries arranged in precise rows, spare uniforms folded to exact specifications, a single photograph tucked inside her footlocker that she never discussed with anyone. Photograph showed a younger version of herself, standing beside an older Hispanic woman, with kind eyes and weathered hands. Maria's mother, Elena Rodriguez, had worked double shifts at a textile factory in El Paso to support her daughter's education, never knowing that her quiet, studious child would one day volunteer for assignments that most hardened warriors would. Refuse. The woman in the photograph had died 3 years ago, believing her daughter was safely stationed at a desk job in Germany, processing supply requisitions and maintaining inventory records. In the communal shower area, Maria maintained the same invisible presence that had become her trademark. She washed quickly and efficiently while conversations flowed around her as if she weren't there. The other Marines discussed weekend plans that would never materialize, complained about the heat that would soon become unbearable, and speculated about enemy activity in the patrol sectors they would soon be entering. "Rodriguez, you even know how to read a GPS?" asked Private Morrison, a 19-year-old from Detroit who had arrived at the base 2 days after Maria. His question drew chuckles from several others who were getting dressed nearby. "Yes," Maria replied without looking up from lacing her boots. The single word carried no defensiveness, no irritation, just a simple acknowledgement of a direct question. This response pattern had become her standard operating procedure. Answer what was asked. Volunteer nothing additional. Maintain the lowest possible profile while still fulfilling her duties. Morrison seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. He had clearly expected more ammunition for the ongoing narrative that painted Maria as out of her depth and potentially dangerous to unit cohesion. Instead, he was left with a straightforward answer that offered no opening for further ridicule. Mess hall at 0500 was a symphony of controlled chaos. Cooks worked behind serving lines, ladling portions of reconstituted eggs and processed meat onto metal trays, while Marines filed through with the mechanical efficiency of an assembly line. Maria took her standard breakfast, black coffee, wheat, toast, and whatever passed for fruit that morning, then found an empty table near the far wall. She ate methodically, chewing each bite exactly 20 times as she had been taught during survival training that wasn't supposed to exist in her official record. Around her, conversations continued to swirl about the day's patrol assignments, with particular attention focused on the newest member of the rotation, Staff Sergeant Collins, a career Marine with 16 years of service and muscles that strained against his desert camouflage uniform, approached Maria's table with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the biggest presence in any room. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing close to 260 pounds, he cast a shadow that seemed to engulf her entire corner of the mess hall. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he was already lowering himself into the chair across from her. His question was rhetorical, a social courtesy that masked what was clearly intended as an interrogation. Maria nodded, continuing to eat while maintaining eye contact that suggested attention without revealing anything about her thoughts or feelings regarding the conversation that was obviously coming. Collins studied her for a moment, taking in details that others had missed. Her posture was relaxed, but ready, shoulders square despite her small frame. Her hands remained visible at all times, positioned in a way that suggested familiarity with situations where visibility meant survival. Most tellingly, her eyes moved in subtle patterns that indicated constant environmental awareness, tracking movement, identifying potential threats, cataloging exits and obstacles. "You know," Collins said finally, leaning back in his chair with calculated casualness, "I've been doing this for a long time, seen a lot of people come through these gates. Most of them you can read pretty quick. Figure out what they're about, what they're running from, what they're trying to prove." He paused, clearly expecting some kind of response. When Maria simply continued eating, he pressed forward. "But you're different. Can't quite put my finger on it. Your file says logistics, medical support, communications, desk jobs basically. Safe assignments." Then suddenly, you're volunteering for combat patrols in one of the hottest zones in the theater. That doesn't add up for me." Maria finished chewing her current bite, swallowed, and took a sip of coffee before speaking. "Sometimes people want to serve where they're needed most," she said, her voice carrying the same neutral tone she used for all official communications. Collins leaned forward, his bulk causing the metal chair to creak under the shifted weight. "See, that's what I mean. That answer sounds rehearsed. Like you've been practicing it. Most people, when they make a career change like this, they've got reasons. Family problems, financial issues, trying to escape something. But you just say, you want to serve where you're needed." The conversation was attracting attention from nearby tables. Marines were beginning to turn in their seats, sensing the potential for entertainment in the form of the big staff sergeant grilling the small newcomer. Maria was aware of the audience, factored it into her response calculations, but showed no external sign that the scrutiny bothered her. "My reasons are my own," she replied simply, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. This response drew murmurs from the observing Marines. In military culture, where personal histories were shared freely and unit cohesion depended on mutual understanding and trust, Maria's privacy was interpreted as standoffishness, potentially even deception. Collins nodded slowly, as if her response had confirmed something he had suspected. "Fair enough. But you understand, out there on patrol, your personal reasons don't matter much. What matters is whether you can keep up, whether you can carry your weight, whether you can be counted on when everything goes to hell." He stood to leave then, paused for one final comment that was clearly intended for the broader audience. "Because out there, Rodriguez, there's no desk to hide behind. No paperwork to process. Just you, your gear, and 12 hours of walking through country where people are actively trying to kill you." After Collins departed, the mess hall gradually returned to its normal volume level, but Maria remained the subject of continued speculation and discussion. She finished her breakfast at the same measured pace, cleaned her tray according to regulations, and prepared to begin the pre-patrol equipment check that would determine whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. In the equipment room, Maria moved through her gear inspection with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on every buckle, every strap, every piece of equipment functioning exactly as designed. Her weapons cleaning was meticulous, her ammunition count precise, her first aid supplies organized for maximum efficiency under stress. Master Sergeant Johnson, the unit's senior non-commissioned officer, observed her preparations with the critical eye of someone who had lost too many Marines to preventable equipment failures. He watched as Maria assembled her kit, noting the way she tested every component, the systematic approach to organization, the quiet confidence with which she handled weapons that many of her critics assumed she had barely qualified to carry. "Rodriguez," he called out as she completed her final checks. "You sure about this? It's not too late to request a different assignment. Nobody would think less of you." Maria looked up from her gear, meeting his gaze with eyes that held depths he couldn't quite interpret. "I'm sure, Master Sergeant." Johnson nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Something about Maria Rodriguez didn't fit the standard patterns he had learned to recognize over 2 decades of military service. But orders were orders, and she had met every qualification requirement. If she said she was ready, then ready she would have to be. As the sun began its merciless climb into the Afghan sky, Maria Rodriguez prepared to step outside the wire for the first time as an official member of a combat patrol, carrying with her secrets that would have shocked every Marine in the unit if they had known the truth about where she had really spent the past 5 years of her military career. The armory buzzed with pre-mission activity as Marines conducted final weapons checks and distributed ammunition according to standard patrol protocols. Maria stood at her assigned station, methodically inspecting her M4 carbine, while conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. The familiar ritual of preparation should have fostered unit cohesion, but instead, it became another opportunity for her fellow Marines to voice their doubts about the upcoming mission. "Hope she knows which end the bullets come out of," muttered Corporal Jackson, a stocky Marine from Tennessee who had made it his personal mission to question every aspect of Maria's presence at Camp Resolute. He spoke just loudly enough for others to hear while maintaining plausible deniability if challenged directly. Lance Corporal Peters, barely 21 years old but already a veteran of 2 Afghan deployments, decided to escalate the commentary. "My little sister back home could probably handle that rifle better. At least she's been hunting since she was 12. His words drew appreciative chuckles from several nearby Marines, who were eager to participate in the informal hazing that had become Maria's daily reality. Maria's hands never paused in their methodical inspection of her weapon, breaking it down and reassembling it with mechanical precision while the comments continued around her. She had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only provided more ammunition for her critics. Instead, she focused on ensuring her equipment would function flawlessly when lives depended on it. The morning briefing took place in a canvas-walled tent that had been baked by 3 months of relentless Afghan sun. Lieutenant Morrison, a career officer with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, spread a topographical map across a folding table while his patrol members gathered in a semicircle. The mission was straightforward, a 12-hour reconnaissance patrol through the Helmand River Valley, with checkpoints at 3 villages suspected of harboring Taliban logistics networks. "Patrol order is as follows," Morrison announced, consulting his clipboard. "Jackson takes point, Peters and Williams cover the flanks, Collins handles communications, and Rodriguez ... He paused, scanning the assembled Marines as if searching for the most appropriate assignment for their questionable new member. "Rodriguez takes rear security." The assignment drew immediate reaction from the patrol members. Rear security was traditionally given to the most expendable team member, the person whose loss would least impact the mission's success. It was a position that required constant vigilance, but offered minimal opportunity to prove oneself in combat situations. "Sir," interrupted Staff Sergeant Collins, his voice carrying the respectful tone required when addressing an officer, but weighted with obvious concern. "With respect, rear security is a critical position. If we get hit from behind, that person needs to be able to hold their own until the rest of us can reposition." Morrison's expression suggested he shared Collins' concerns, but was constrained by orders from higher command. "Rodriguez requested combat assignment, Staff Sergeant. This is combat assignment. Unless you have specific intelligence suggesting she's unqualified for the position." The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, challenging Collins to either voice his doubts officially or accept the assignment as given. After a moment of visible internal struggle, he nodded his acceptance while his expression conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud. The patrol stepped off at 0700, moving through the main gate of Camp Resolute with the measured pace of professionals entering hostile territory. Maria took her assigned position at the rear of the formation, her equipment weighing exactly 47 pounds, according to regulations, though several Marines had speculated that the load might be too much for her slight frame to handle effectively. Terrain outside the wire was unforgiving, rocky hills covered with sparse vegetation, dry creek beds that could conceal improvised explosive devices, and endless stretches of open ground that offered no protection from enemy observation or sniper fire. The temperature was already climbing toward the 100-degree mark that would make the next 12 hours a test of endurance, even for experienced veterans. Within the first hour, the informal hazing resumed with new intensity. Jackson, walking 30 meters ahead of the main formation, began calling back status checks that were clearly designed to highlight Maria's perceived inadequacies. "Rear security, how's your gear holding up back there?" he called, his voice carrying clearly across the rocky landscape. The question was phrased as legitimate tactical communication, but the underlying tone suggested he expected to hear complaints about weight, fatigue, or equipment problems. "Gear is secure," Maria responded, her voice steady and professional despite the implied mockery in Jackson's inquiry. 20 minutes later, Jackson tried again. "Rodriguez, you keeping up okay? Don't want to leave anyone behind." This time his concern was so exaggerated that even Lieutenant Morrison glanced back with a slight frown, recognizing the pattern of harassment, but uncertain how to address it. Without undermining unit discipline, Maria's response was identical to her previous. One, professional, minimal, offering no emotional reaction that could be used against her. But privately, she was conducting her own assessment of the patrol's tactical formation, noting weaknesses in their spacing, gaps in their observation patterns, and subtle signs of complacency that suggested they had become too comfortable with routine missions. The first village checkpoint arrived at 0-9-30, a cluster of mud brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard where goats wandered freely and children watched the American patrol with expressions that revealed nothing about their loyalties or intentions. Standard procedure required the Marines to establish security positions around the perimeter while Morrison and an interpreter conducted interviews with local residents. "Rodriguez, you stay with the vehicles," Collins ordered, gesturing toward 2 Humvees that had been positioned to provide quick evacuation if the situation deteriorated. "Keep an eye on the road. Let us know if you see anything suspicious." The assignment was another form of marginalization, keeping Maria away from the primary mission while giving her responsibilities that any untrained civilian could handle. But as she took her position near the vehicles, she began conducting her own surveillance of the area, noting details that her more experienced colleagues had overlooked in their rush to establish what they considered proper security protocols. She observed a young Afghan boy, perhaps 8 years old, who kept glancing toward a specific building on the village's eastern edge. His behavior pattern suggested knowledge of something concealed inside, possibly weapons or communication equipment. She also noticed fresh tire tracks leading away from the village toward the hills, tracks that were too new to have been made by local farmers, but perfectly consistent with recent Taliban supply movements. When the patrol reconvened after 45 minutes of interviews that had yielded no useful intelligence, Maria considered reporting her observations. But past experience had taught her that unsolicited input from the squad's least respected member would be dismissed as amateur speculation, potentially even undermining the unit's confidence in their official intelligence gathering procedures. Second checkpoint proved more challenging, with local residents displaying obvious hostility toward the American presence. Children threw rocks from concealed positions, dogs barked incessantly, and adult males disappeared into buildings whenever the Marines approached. The tension was palpable, the kind of atmospheric pressure that experienced combat veterans recognized as a prelude to violence. "This place gives me the creeps," whispered Peters, adjusting his grip on his rifle while scanning the rooftops for potential sniper positions. "Feel like we're being watched from every direction." "Stay sharp," Morrison ordered, though his own nervousness was evident in the way he constantly adjusted his equipment and checked his radio frequencies. "We'll make this quick and move on to checkpoint 3. During the security halt, Jackson decided to test Maria's vigilance with another public challenge. "Hey, Rodriguez," he called out, loud enough for the entire patrol to hear. "What's your assessment of this location? See anything we should be worried about?" The question was clearly intended as a trap. If Maria identified legitimate threats that the more experienced Marines had missed, she would appear to be showing off or second-guessing her superiors. If she reported nothing significant, she would confirm their assessment that she lacked the experience and instincts necessary for effective combat operations. Maria scanned the village carefully, her eyes tracking movement patterns and identifying potential danger. zones with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had survived similar situations before. She could see at least 3 positions that would provide effective sniper coverage, 2 escape routes that enemy fighters could use to withdraw after an attack, and 1 building that showed signs of recent fortification consistent with weapons. Storage. Situation appears manageable, she replied finally, choosing diplomatic language that conveyed professional assessment without challenging the established hierarchy. But privately, she was calculating response times, identifying cover positions, and preparing for contingencies that she hoped would never become necessary. The patrol continued through the scorching afternoon, with Maria maintaining her position at the rear of the formation while enduring a steady stream of subtle challenges to her competence and commitment. Each test was designed to demonstrate her unsuitability for combat operations, but none of her critics realized they were actually providing her with detailed intelligence about their own capabilities, limitations, and psychological profiles. That would prove invaluable when the real test came. The 3rd checkpoint sat in a valley depression where the morning's heat had already begun creating shimmering mirages above the packed earth. As the patrol approached the settlement, Maria's behavior began to shift in ways so subtle that only the most observant would have noticed. Her head movements became more systematic, following patterns that suggested she was conducting threat assessments according to protocols that weren't taught in basic infantry training, while her fellow Marines focused on the obvious tactical considerations, rooftop positions, potential ambush sites, civilian movement patterns. Maria was analyzing factors that existed several layers deeper. She noted the absence of working-age men in the village square, the positioning of women and children that suggested they had been coached on where to stand during American patrols, and most significantly, the presence of fresh concrete patches on several building walls that indicated recent repairs consistent with weapons cache concealment. Lance Corporal Davidson, a communications specialist from Oregon who had been watching Maria with growing curiosity, noticed her unusual attention to seemingly irrelevant details. "Rodriguez," he said during a brief halt, "what's so interesting about that water well over there? You've been staring at it for 5 minutes." Maria's gaze didn't waver from the stone structure that sat 30 meters from the village center. To most observers, it appeared to be a standard water source, identical to dozens of others they had encountered during previous patrols. But she had identified 3 specific anomalies that suggested the well had been modified for purposes other than water collection. "Just checking the sight lines," she replied, which was technically accurate, but revealed nothing about the sophisticated analysis she was actually conducting. The well's positioning created a perfect blind spot from the village's main approaches. Its stone construction would provide excellent protection for concealed personnel, and the rope system used for drawing water had been modified with hardware that could easily support communication equipment. Davidson accepted her explanation without further questioning, but he filed away the interaction as another piece of evidence that Maria Rodriguez was not quite what she appeared to be. Her explanations always made sense on the surface, but they never fully addressed the depth of observation that prompted her questions in the first place. During the security halt, while other Marines focused on maintaining perimeter watch and staying hydrated in the increasing heat, Maria conducted what appeared to be routine equipment maintenance. She cleaned her rifle with the standard issue cleaning kit, checked her ammunition supply, and adjusted her gear for maximum comfort during the remaining hours of patrol. But embedded within these ordinary activities were practices that would have puzzled anyone familiar with conventional military training. She disassembled her weapon using a technique that minimized noise and required fewer hand movements than the standard military procedure. Her ammunition count included not just the obvious considerations of available rounds, but calculations of ballistic performance at various distances and atmospheric conditions. Most tellingly, her gear adjustments followed principles of weight, distribution and accessibility that suggested familiarity with scenarios involving extended movement under combat conditions. Staff Sergeant Collins, who had been tasked with evaluating Maria's performance throughout the patrol, positioned himself where he could observe her activities without being obvious about his surveillance. What he saw challenged many of his preconceptions about their newest team member, but he couldn't quite identify why her behavior seemed noteworthy. "She moves different," he mentioned quietly to Corporal Jackson during a brief conversation break. "Can't put my finger on it, but something about the way she handles her equipment, the way she positions herself. It's like she's been doing this longer than her file suggests." Jackson, who had invested considerable effort in establishing Maria as the patrol's weak link, was reluctant to acknowledge any evidence that contradicted his assessment. "Different doesn't mean better," he replied. "Maybe she just learned some things wrong and needs retraining." But Collins wasn't entirely convinced by his own previous judgments. He had begun noticing details that didn't fit the narrative of Maria. As an inexperienced logistics specialist trying to prove herself in a combat role, her breathing remained steady despite the physical demands of the patrol. Her situational awareness extended beyond her assigned sector of responsibility. Most significantly, she demonstrated a level of comfort with her weapons and equipment that typically required months of intensive field experience to develop. The patrol resumed movement toward their final checkpoint, following a route that Lieutenant Morrison had selected based on intelligence reports and topographical analysis. The path led through a narrow valley where rocky outcroppings provided natural cover, but also created numerous potential ambush positions. Standard doctrine required increased vigilance and modified formation to account for the elevated threat. Leveled as they entered the valley approach, Maria's behavior underwent another subtle transformation. Her movements became more fluid, her positioning more deliberate. She began conducting what appeared to be casual glances toward specific terrain features, but her eye movements followed patterns consistent with advanced reconnaissance techniques. Designed to identify concealed threats and defensive positions, Private Morrison, the youngest member of the patrol, had been assigned to maintain visual contact with Maria as part of his training in rear security procedures. What he observed during the valley transit would later become the subject of numerous conversations among the unit's junior enlisted personnel. "She wasn't just watching our six," Morrison would tell anyone willing to listen. "She was doing something else, something more complicated. Like she was mapping every rock, every bush, every possible hiding spot. And the way she moved, it was like she knew exactly where to step to make the least noise." Maria's enhanced vigilance proved prescient when she detected signs of recent human activity in areas where intelligence reports had suggested minimal enemy presence. Fresh footprints in soft earth, broken vegetation consistent with equipment being dragged through concealed routes, and most importantly, the unmistakable scent of gun oil locations where such odors had no legitimate explanation. She faced a tactical dilemma that highlighted the complexity of her situation. Reporting these observations would require explaining how she had detected evidence that more experienced Marines had overlooked, potentially raising questions about her background and training. Remaining silent might allow the patrol to walk into a dangerous situation without adequate preparation. Her solution demonstrated the careful balance she had learned to maintain between competence and concealment. During a routine radio check, she positioned herself near Lieutenant Morrison and spoke in a voice just loud enough for him to overhear. "Movement indicators in Sector 7, she reported to no one in particular, as if conducting a private assessment of potential threats. Recommend increased vigilance for the next 2 clicks." Morrison, trained to respond to any information that might affect patrol security, immediately questioned her about the observation. "What kind of movement indicators, Rodriguez?" "Where specifically?" Maria's response was carefully calibrated to provide useful tactical information without revealing the sophisticated analysis that had led to her conclusions. Disturbed vegetation, possible equipment drag marks. Could be nothing, but the patterns look fresh. Morrison relayed the information to the rest of the patrol, crediting Maria with the observation, but framing it as the kind of basic awareness that any competent Marine should demonstrate. The patrol's tactical posture shifted accordingly, with increased spacing between team members and heightened attention to potential ambush positions. 20 minutes later, the patrol encountered evidence that validated Maria's warning. A hastily abandoned campsite showed signs of recent occupation by a small group of armed individuals who had apparently departed within the previous 12 hours. Equipment impressions in the dirt suggested heavy weapons, and the positioning of the site provided excellent observation and fields of fire covering the route the Marines had been following. "Good catch, Rodriguez," Lieutenant Morrison acknowledged, though his tone suggested surprise that their least experienced member had detected threats that others had missed. "That could have been a problem if we'd walked into it blind." The acknowledgement was the first positive recognition Maria had received since joining the unit, but it also attracted unwanted attention to capabilities she preferred to keep hidden. Several Marines began studying her with new curiosity, trying to reconcile her apparent inexperience with demonstrated skills that suggested otherwise. Corporal Peters approached Maria during the next security halt with questions that indicated growing suspicion about her background. "Where did you say you served before this assignment?" he asked, though he already knew her official service record by heart. "Logistics support, medical assistance, communications," Maria replied, reciting the standard summary that appeared in her personnel file. But Peters noticed that her answer, while technically accurate, seemed rehearsed in a way that suggested she had been asked the same question many times before. "Yeah, but where specifically? What units? What bases? I might know some of the people you worked with." Peters' persistence reflected a growing awareness among the patrol members that their assumptions about Maria might have been premature. Maria's response demonstrated the same careful evasion she had perfected over months of similar inquiries. "Various assignments, mostly temporary duty. You know how it is with support roles. They move you around wherever you're needed." The explanation was plausible enough to discourage further questioning while revealing nothing substantial about her actual experience. As the patrol prepared to approach their final checkpoint, Maria Rodriguez had successfully planted the first seeds of doubt about the narrative that had defined her place within the unit. Her fellow Marines were beginning to recognize that their supposedly inexperienced teammate possessed capabilities that didn't match her official background, but none of them yet understood the true extent of what she was hiding or why such deception might be necessary. The final checkpoint emerged from the heat haze like a mirage made real, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around what had once been a functioning marketplace, but now served primarily as a way station for smugglers and insurgents moving supplies through the valley network. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, but as the patrol approached the settlement's outer perimeter, Maria detected atmospheric changes that suggested the situation was far more complex than their briefing materials had suggested. The silence was wrong. In previous villages, they had encountered the normal sounds of rural Afghan life: children playing, goats bleating, the distant hum of conversation, and daily activities. Here, the only sounds were wind moving through empty buildings and the occasional creak of metal sheeting that had been loosened by months of neglect. The absence of human activity in what should have been a populated area triggered alarm responses that Maria recognized from experiences her fellow Marines couldn't imagine. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand, signaling the patrol to halt while he conducted a visual assessment of the settlement ahead. Through his binoculars, he could see buildings that appeared abandoned, streets that showed no signs of recent foot traffic, and an overall emptiness that contradicted intelligence estimates of 30 to 40 residents who should have been visible during normal daylight hours. "Something's not right here," Morrison muttered, lowering his binoculars and consulting the map coordinates that had brought them to this location. Intel said this place was active. Where is everyone? Staff Sergeant Collins moved forward to join the lieutenant's assessment, his bulk casting a shadow across the rocky ground as he studied the village through his own optical equipment. What he observed reinforced Morrison's concerns, while adding new dimensions of potential threat that hadn't been obvious from their initial approach angle. Windows and doors are all secured, Collins reported. But not like they're abandoned. More like people left in a hurry and tried to protect their property. Fresh tire tracks leading out of town toward the eastern hills. Recent ones, maybe 6 to 8 hours old. Maria positioned herself where she could observe both the village ahead and the terrain they had already crossed, following rear security protocols while conducting her own analysis of the tactical situation. Her assessment extended beyond the obvious indicators that were troubling Morrison and Collins, incorporating factors that required experience with asymmetric warfare tactics and insurgent behavior patterns. The building positioning created perfect interlocking fields of fire that would allow a small defending force to control all approaches to the village center. The absence of civilian population eliminated concerns about collateral damage that might otherwise constrain enemy response options. Most significantly, the settlement's location in the Valley Depression would funnel any rescue or reinforcement attempts through predictable routes that could be easily targeted with indirect fire weapons. "Sir," Maria called out, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Lieutenant Morrison without broadcasting their conversation to potential observers. "Request permission to conduct extended reconnaissance of our current position." Morrison turned toward her with the expression of someone who had temporarily forgotten about the patrol member he considered least qualified to offer tactical input. "What kind of reconnaissance, Rodriguez?" "We've got clear lines of sight on the objective area." Maria's response was carefully structured to sound like a routine security measure rather than an indication that she had detected specific threats. "Just want to verify our withdrawal routes are still clear, sir. Make sure we haven't picked up any followers since the last checkpoint." The request was tactically sound and fell within her assigned responsibilities for rear security, so Morrison approved it with a dismissive nod. But as Maria moved into position to conduct her supposed route verification, she was actually implementing surveillance techniques designed to identify concealed observers and potential ambush positions that might threaten the patrol's safety. Within 10 minutes, she had confirmed her worst suspicions. The patrol was being observed by at least 3 different groups positioned in elevated terrain that provided excellent visibility of American movements while remaining concealed from standard reconnaissance methods. Radio intercepts indicated coordination between the observation teams and additional forces that were apparently positioning themselves to exploit whatever opportunity might present itself. More alarming was her detection of vehicle movement in areas that should have been empty based on intelligence reports. The sounds were consistent with technical vehicles, pickup trucks modified to carry crew-served weapons, moving into positions that would allow them to interdict the patrol's planned withdrawal route back to Camp Resolute. Maria faced the same dilemma she had encountered earlier, but with stakes that were exponentially higher. Reporting her observations would require explaining capabilities that didn't exist in her official background, but remaining silent might allow her fellow Marines to walk into a carefully prepared killing zone. Her solution demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had kept her alive through situations that had claimed the lives of more conventionally trained operatives. She began experiencing what appeared to be equipment problems that required her to move through different positions around the patrol's perimeter, each movement allowing her to gather additional intelligence while maintaining the appearance of routine maintenance activities. "Rodriguez, what's your status back there?" Collins called out after observing her movement pattern for several minutes. "Radio interference, Staff Sergeant," Maria replied, which was technically accurate since she was indeed monitoring radio frequencies, though not for the reasons Collins assumed. trying to identify the source and maintain communications with base. The explanation satisfied Collins while providing Maria with justification for the extended monitoring that was revealing increasingly disturbing intelligence about enemy preparations. She was detecting coordination between multiple groups, weapons positioning that suggested preparation for a significant engagement, and most ominously, references to high-value targets that clearly indicated the enemy had identified the American. Patrol is an opportunity worth considerable risk and resource investment. Lieutenant Morrison was growing impatient with the extended halt and the apparent equipment problems that were preventing them from completing their mission according to schedule. "Rodriguez, how much longer do you need to sort out your communications issues?" Before Maria could respond, the tactical situation changed with explosive suddenness. The crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds that had been pre-positioned to target the exact location where the patrol had stopped. Staff Sergeant Collins, who had been standing in the open while observing the village ahead, dropped to the ground with a grunt of pain and surprise. Blood immediately began spreading across his desert camouflage uniform from a wound in his upper thigh that had severed the femoral artery and created a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. "Contact! Contact!" Morrison shouted into his radio while attempting to locate the source of the sniper fire that had initiated the ambush. "We have one Marine down, need immediate medical evacuation and close air support." The mortar rounds began impacting around their position with accuracy that indicated the enemy had been observing and plotting targets for an extended period. Explosions threw dirt and rock fragments in every direction while the patrol members scrambled for whatever cover they could find in terrain that had been specifically chosen for its lack of defensive positions. Collins was losing blood at a rate that would prove fatal within minutes unless someone could provide immediate medical attention. His massive frame, which had been such an imposing presence during the morning's harassment of Maria, was now working against him as the wound continued to pump blood onto the rocky ground beneath him. "I can't move him," Peters shouted over the sound of continuing explosions. "He's too heavy, and this wound needs pressure, or he's going to bleed out." Maria looked at the situation with eyes that had seen similar scenarios before, calculated the tactical requirements with experience that officially didn't exist, and made a decision that would forever change how her fellow Marines understood both her capabilities and her character. The moment had arrived when concealment was no longer possible, when lives depended on abilities she could no longer hide. Without announcing her intentions or asking for permission, Maria Rodriguez began moving toward the wounded staff sergeant. With purpose and determination that would have shocked anyone who still believed she was nothing more than an inexperienced logistics specialist trying to prove herself in a combat environment she didn't understand, Maria moved across the rocky terrain with fluid precision that seemed to defy the chaos erupting around their position. Mortar rounds continued to impact with methodical accuracy, while sniper fire kept the patrol pinned behind inadequate cover, but she navigated through the deadly environment as if following a predetermined path that existed only in her mind. She reached Collins' position just as Lieutenant Morrison was attempting to apply pressure to the massive wound in the staff sergeant's thigh. Morrison's hands were shaking, whether from adrenaline or the recognition that his field medical training was insufficient for the severity of Collins' injury, and blood continued to flow between his fingers despite his desperate efforts to stem the hemorrhaging. "Move aside," Maria said, her voice carrying an authority that Morrison had never heard from her before. Without waiting for acknowledgement, she positioned herself beside Collins and began implementing trauma care procedures that went far beyond the basic first aid taught to standard infantry personnel. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she identified the exact location of the arterial damage, applied direct pressure using techniques designed to maximize blood flow restriction while minimizing tissue damage, and simultaneously began preparing Collins for transport under combat conditions. The transformation in her demeanor was so complete that Morrison found himself automatically following her instructions despite his rank, advantage, and supposed experience superiority. "Jackson, I need you to lay down suppressing fire toward the eastern ridge," Maria called out while maintaining pressure on Collins' wound. "Peters, start preparing smoke grenades for concealment. We're moving in 90 seconds whether the bleeding stops or not." Her tactical assessment of their situation was delivered with the calm efficiency of someone who had managed similar crises before. But none of the Marines had time to question where she had acquired such expertise. Collins was growing pale from blood loss, his breathing becoming shallow, and enemy fire was intensifying as additional insurgent positions revealed themselves around the valley perimeter. "Rodriguez, he weighs at least 300 pounds, Morrison protested, recognizing what she was planning. "Even with 2 people carrying, we'll never get him back to the extraction point. We need to wait for helicopter evacuation," Maria continued, her medical procedures while simultaneously calculating distances, terrain obstacles, and tactical requirements for movement under fire. Her response revealed planning capabilities that extended far beyond anything in her official training record. "Helicopter. Can't land under this fire, and Collins will be dead in 20 minutes if we don't move now," she replied. "I can carry him. You focus on maintaining perimeter security and calling in air support to cover our withdrawal." The assertion seemed impossible to everyone who heard it. Collins was not just heavy. He was 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, wearing full combat gear, and bleeding from a wound that would require constant medical attention during any attempted evacuation. The idea that Maria Rodriguez, who barely exceeded 5 feet in height and weighed less than half what Collins did, could carry him 5 miles across hostile terrain seemed beyond the realm of physical possibility. But before anyone could voice further objections, Maria was demonstrating capabilities that challenged every assumption they had made about her background and training. She applied a tourniquet with professional competence, administered pain medication from her medical kit using dosages that suggested advanced pharmaceutical knowledge, and began preparing Collins for transport using techniques that none of them recognized from standard military manuals. "This is going to hurt," she told Collins, who was still conscious despite his blood loss. "But I need you to stay awake and help me as much as you can. Lock your arms around my shoulders and don't let go no matter what happens." Collins tried to protest, tried to argue that the plan was suicidal for both of them, but Maria was already positioning herself to lift his massive frame. The enemy fire was intensifying, with rifle rounds impacting closer to their position and mortar explosions. Walking steadily toward their inadequate cover, what happened next would be discussed and analyzed by every Marine who witnessed it for years afterward. Maria Rodriguez, who had been dismissed as physically inadequate for combat operations, lifted Staff Sergeant Collins onto her back and began moving across the rocky terrain with a strength and endurance that defied every law of physics and biomechanics. That her fellow Marines thought they understood. Her movement technique was unlike anything taught in conventional military training. She maintained perfect balance despite carrying more than twice her own body weight, negotiated obstacles with precision that suggested intimate familiarity with load-bearing movement under stress, and sustained a pace that kept them ahead of pursuing enemy forces while never once losing control of her massive burden. "Jesus Christ," Jackson whispered as he watched Maria disappear over a ridge with Collins still secured to her back. Where the hell did she learn to do that? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Lieutenant Morrison was simultaneously calling in air support, coordinating the patrol's withdrawal, and trying to process what he had just witnessed. The woman who had been assigned rear security because of doubts about her combat Readiness was now single-handedly executing a casualty evacuation that would have challenged a team of experienced special operations personnel. The first mile was covered under direct enemy fire, with Maria moving through terrain that provided minimal concealment while maintaining medical monitoring of Colin's condition. She adjusted her pace based on his vital signs, modified her route to minimize jarring that might worsen his wound, and somehow managed to return suppressive fire when enemy positions got too close to their line of movement. "Stay with me, Collins," she said during a brief halt behind a boulder formation. "Your pulse is steady, bleeding is controlled. We're going to make it." Collins, who had regained some strength after Maria's medical intervention, was experiencing a profound shift in his understanding of the woman who was literally carrying him to safety. The muscles in her back and shoulders were working with mechanical efficiency that suggested extensive conditioning for exactly this type of load-bearing movement. Her breathing remained controlled despite the extraordinary physical demands, and her tactical awareness extended to threats and opportunities that he hadn't noticed even from his elevated position. "Rodriguez," he managed to say during another brief rest stop, "where did you really serve before this assignment?" Maria's response was delivered while she monitored his wound, checked their position on her GPS device, and calculated the remaining distance to the extraction point. "Some places don't appear in official records, Staff Sergeant. Some assignments require different kinds of documentation." The cryptic answer only deepened Colin's growing realization that Maria Rodriguez represented something far removed from the logistics specialist she had been presented as. Her current performance suggested experience with operations that officially didn't exist, training that wasn't available through conventional military programs, and capabilities that were normally restricted to the most elite special operations units. By the third mile, word of the ongoing evacuation had reached Camp Resolute through Lieutenant Morrison's radio reports. The base commander was mobilizing every available asset to support the rescue operation, but the tactical situation required Maria to continue moving through hostile territory with minimal external assistance until air support could establish effective suppression of enemy positions. Her performance during this phase of the evacuation eliminated any remaining doubts about her physical capabilities while raising profound questions about her background and training. She maintained tactical communications with Morrison's patrol, provided medical updates on Colin's condition, and continued to engage enemy forces that attempted to interdict their route, all while carrying a load that should have been impossible for someone of her size and apparent experience level. "Base, this is Morrison," the lieutenant reported during one of his periodic updates. "Rodriguez has covered 4 miles with a casualty. Collins is stable. Enemy contact is sporadic. I don't know how she's doing this, but she's doing it." The response from base operations reflected the same bewilderment that was affecting everyone involved in the situation. Maria Rodriguez had transformed from the patrol's perceived weak link into a one-person rescue operation that was defying every conventional understanding of human physical limitations and tactical capabilities. As they approached the final mile to the extraction point, Collins had recovered enough strength to appreciate the full magnitude of what Maria was accomplishing. She had carried his 300-pound frame across 5 miles of hostile terrain, under enemy fire, while providing continuous medical care and maintaining tactical awareness that had kept them both alive when lesser performance would have resulted in their deaths. "I owe you an apology," Collins said as Maria prepared for the final push toward safety. "We all do." Maria's response was delivered without breaking stride, her voice steady despite the extraordinary demands she had been meeting for the past several hours. "Apologies can wait, Staff Sergeant. Right now, let's just focus on getting home." The extraction point materialized through the dust and heat like an oasis of salvation, with 2 military ambulances positioned behind a defensive perimeter that had been hastily established by Marines from the base's rapid response team. Maria approached the medical personnel with Collins still secured to her back, her uniform soaked with sweat and blood, but her movement remained steady and controlled despite covering 5 miles of hostile terrain under impossible conditions. The senior medic, Hospital Corpsman First Class Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared surname, rushed forward with a stretcher team, his expression shifting from professional urgency to undisguised amazement as he realized what he was witnessing. The small, female Marine he had been briefed to expect was delivering a casualty who outweighed her by more than 200 pounds, and she showed no signs of the exhaustion that should have incapacitated anyone attempting such a rescue. "Jesus, Rodriguez," the corpsman whispered as Maria carefully lowered Collins onto the waiting stretcher. "How the hell did you carry him this far?" The terrain report said 5 miles of rocky hills and enemy contact. Maria stepped back from the stretcher, finally allowing herself to show the first signs of physical strain after maintaining perfect composure throughout the evacuation. Her breathing was elevated but controlled, her hands steady as she provided medical details to the treatment team, and her voice remained clear and professional despite what should have been overwhelming exhaustion. Tourniquet applied at 1430 hours, pressure dressing secure, administered 8 milligrams morphine for pain management, she reported with clinical precision. Patient remained conscious throughout transport, vital signs stable, estimated. Blood loss approximately 2.5 liters. The medical assessment she provided contained technical details and dosage calculations that went far beyond basic combat lifesaver training. Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez found himself automatically accepting her evaluation and building his treatment plan around information that demonstrated advanced medical knowledge typically possessed only by experienced field surgeons or special operations medics. As Collins was loaded into the ambulance for immediate transport to the base hospital, he managed to catch Maria's attention one final time. His face had regained some color thanks to the 4 fluids the corpsman had administered, but his eyes held a new understanding of the woman who had literally carried him to safety. "Rodriguez," he called out as the ambulance doors began to close. "When I get out of medical, we need to talk. All of us need to talk." The statement carried implications that extended far beyond gratitude for the rescue. Collins was acknowledging that fundamental assumptions about Maria Rodriguez required complete reevaluation, and that the extraordinary performance they had witnessed demanded explanations that her official service record couldn't provide. Major Catherine Hendricks, the base intelligence officer, arrived at the extraction point just as Maria was completing her after-action report to Lieutenant Morrison. Hendricks had been monitoring the situation through radio communications, but seeing Maria in person, covered in another Marine's blood, showing minimal effects from a feat of endurance that should have been impossible, triggered professional instincts honed through years of identifying personnel who didn't match their official documentation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Hendricks said, her use of the formal address indicating this was now an official inquiry rather than casual conversation. "I need you to accompany me back to base for debriefing. There are some questions about today's events that require clarification." Maria nodded her acceptance, but her expression revealed nothing about what she might be thinking or feeling regarding the increased scrutiny that was obviously coming. She had maintained operational security for years by avoiding exactly this kind of attention, but Collins' life had been worth the exposure of capabilities she had worked so hard to conceal. The convoy back to Camp Resolute moved with heightened security protocols, recognizing that enemy forces might still be tracking the Marines who had escaped their carefully planned ambush. During the 20-minute journey, Maria sat silently while her fellow patrol members struggled to process what they had witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of military capabilities and human performance. Private Morrison, the youngest member of the patrol, finally voiced the question that everyone was thinking. "Rodriguez, that thing you did back there, carrying Collins 5 miles. Where did you learn techniques like that? That wasn't in any manual I've ever seen. Maria's response followed the same pattern of careful evasion she had perfected over months of similar inquiries. Emergency situations require people to exceed their normal limitations, she replied. Training and adrenaline can produce unexpected results. But the explanation no longer satisfied anyone who had witnessed her performance. The rescue hadn't been a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. It had been a sustained demonstration of capabilities that suggested extensive preparation for exactly such scenarios. Her movement techniques, medical knowledge, and tactical awareness all pointed toward training programs that didn't exist in conventional military education. Lance Corporal Peters, who had been questioning Maria's background since her arrival at the base, decided to press for more specific information. That medical treatment you provided, the dosage calculations, the way you applied that tourniquet, that was advanced trauma care. Where did you get medical training like that? The question attracted attention from other patrol members who were beginning to recognize that Maria's performance had involved multiple skill sets that didn't appear anywhere in her official records. Combat medicine, tactical movement under fire, load-bearing techniques, and situational awareness all demonstrated proficiency levels that typically required years of specialized training. Maria's response revealed nothing while technically answering the question. I completed additional medical training during previous assignments, she said. Different units have different requirements for personnel qualifications. Major Hendricks, who had been listening to the conversation while monitoring radio traffic about the ongoing enemy situation, recognized the patterns of deflection that characterized personnel with classified backgrounds. Maria's answers were truthful but incomplete, providing just enough information to discourage further questioning while revealing nothing substantial about her actual experience or training. Upon arrival at Camp Resolute, the base commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, was waiting to personally debrief the patrol members about the ambush and rescue operation. Webb was a career Marine with 26 years of service who had earned his reputation through combat, leadership in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he possessed the institutional knowledge to recognize exceptional performance when he encountered it. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Webb said as Maria reported for debriefing, I've been reviewing the radio transcripts from today's operation. According to Lieutenant Morrison's reports, you carried a 300-pound casualty 5 miles through hostile territory while under enemy fire. Is that assessment accurate? Maria maintained her position of attention while responding with characteristic brevity. Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Collins required immediate medical evacuation, and helicopter extraction wasn't feasible under the tactical conditions. Webb studied her for a long moment, taking in details that others had missed. Her uniform bore evidence of the extraordinary physical demands she had met, but her posture remained perfect, her breathing normal, and her demeanor suggested she could repeat the performance if circumstances required it. Staff Sergeant, in 30 years of military service, I've never seen or heard of anyone accomplishing what you did today, Webb said. That level of performance suggests training and experience that doesn't appear in your personnel file. Would you care to explain the discrepancy? The direct question from the base commander represented a turning point that Maria had been anticipating since her arrival at Camp Resolute. She could continue the evasions that had protected her cover for months, or she could provide explanations that would forever change how she was perceived and utilized by the military establishment. Sir, some training programs and operational assignments are classified at levels that don't appear in standard personnel documentation, Maria replied. My previous service included activities that require special security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. The admission was carefully worded to acknowledge classified background without revealing specifics, but it confirmed Webb's suspicions that Maria Rodriguez represented something far different from the logistics specialist she had been presented as. The colonel had sufficient experience with special operations personnel to recognize the signs of advanced training and combat experience that transcended conventional military programs. "I see," Webb said, though his expression indicated he was beginning to understand far more than Maria's brief explanation had revealed. "Staff Sergeant, you'll remain available for additional questioning while we conduct a more thorough review of your background and qualifications. In the meantime, you're restricted to base pending completion of this investigation." As Maria was dismissed from the initial debriefing, word of her extraordinary rescue was already spreading throughout Camp Resolute. The Marines who had witnessed her performance were sharing their accounts with anyone willing to listen, and each retelling seemed to add new dimensions to what was rapidly becoming legendary within the military community. The transformation in how she was perceived had begun, but Maria understood that the revelation of her true capabilities was only the first step in a process that would ultimately expose secrets she had spent years protecting. The price of saving Colin's life was the end of her carefully maintained anonymity, and there would be consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of their remote Afghan outpost. The base mess hall that evening buzzed with conversations, unlike any heard since Camp Resolute's establishment 18 months earlier. Marines who had dismissed Maria Rodriguez as a liability less than 12 hours ago now spoke her name with reverence, recounting details of the rescue with the kind of awestruck precision typically reserved for legendary combat actions that would be studied for generations. Corporal Hayes, who had opened the morning with mockery about Maria's ability to carry her own pack, sat at a corner table staring into his coffee cup with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled. The woman he had predicted would get someone killed had instead saved the life of the unit's most respected non-commissioned officer through a display of capability that challenged every assumption about human physical limitations. "I was wrong," Hayes said quietly when approached by other Marines seeking his perspective on the day's events. "We were all wrong. I don't know what Rodriguez is, but she's not what any of us thought she was." The admission carried weight beyond simple acknowledgement of error. Hayes was effectively confessing that his judgment, his experience, his ability to assess personnel capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. For a career Marine whose survival depended on accurate threat assessment and tactical evaluation, such a confession represented a profound crisis of professional confidence. Lance Corporal Peters, who had spent weeks questioning Maria's background and qualifications, found himself reviewing every interaction they had shared with new understanding. Her brief answers that he had interpreted as evasiveness now seemed like careful operational security. Her quiet demeanor that appeared antisocial was actually the disciplined restraint of someone protecting classified information. She knew, Peters told a group of junior enlisted personnel who had gathered to discuss the implications of Maria's revealed capabilities. "Every time we questioned her, every time we made jokes about her size or experience, she knew she could have shut us up any time she wanted. But she didn't. She just took it." The realization that Maria had endured months of harassment while possessing the ability to demonstrate her superiority at any moment added layers of complexity to how the Marines were processing their revised understanding of her character. She hadn't been tolerating their mockery because she was weak. She had been protecting information that was apparently more important than her personal comfort or professional reputation. Sergeant First Class Williams, the Alabama native who had questioned Maria's suitability for combat operations, approached several of his fellow Marines with a proposal that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. "We need to apologize," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the magnitude of their collective misjudgment. "Not just for being wrong, but for treating her like she didn't belong here when she's obviously more qualified than any of us." The suggestion sparked immediate debate among Marines who were struggling to reconcile their previous assessments with the evidence of Maria's extraordinary performance. Some argued that apologies were unnecessary since Maria had never complained about their treatment or requested different handling. Others maintained that their behavior had been based on reasonable assumptions given her apparent background and physical characteristics. But Williams pressed his point with the persistence of someone who had recognized a fundamental truth about military leadership and unit cohesion. "It's not about whether she complained or whether our assumptions seemed reasonable," he explained. "It's about the fact that we failed to recognize exceptional capability because it didn't match our preconceptions. That's a failure of professional judgment that could get people killed in other situations." Meanwhile, in the base intelligence office, Major Hendricks was conducting a comprehensive review of Maria's service record with the assistance of classification specialists who had been flown in from Kabul specifically to address the discrepancies that had been revealed by the day's events. The investigation was yielding information that painted a picture of Maria Rodriguez as someone whose official documentation represented only a fraction of her actual military experience. The initial findings indicated that Maria had been involved in operations conducted by units that officially didn't exist, participating in missions that were classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to discuss. Her apparent assignments to logistics, medical, and communications roles had actually been cover stories designed to provide plausible explanations for her presence at various military installations while she conducted activities that couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. "This is unprecedented," Major Hendricks told Colonel Webb during a private briefing session. "Rodriguez has been operating under deep cover for at least 3 years, with documentation that would have passed any standard security review. Her real training includes advanced combat medicine, special operations techniques, and survival skills that explain everything we witnessed today." Colonel Webb absorbed the information while reviewing classified reports that detailed Maria's actual service history. The documents revealed participation in operations that had been critical to American strategic interests in multiple theaters, with performance evaluations that consistently rated her among the most capable personnel in highly selective special operations programs. "Why was she assigned to our base under false documentation?" Webb asked, though he suspected the answer would involve considerations that extended far beyond normal military personnel management. Hendricks consulted additional classified materials before responding. According to these files, Rodriguez requested reassignment to a conventional unit after completing a particularly difficult operation that resulted in significant casualties among her team members. She wanted to serve in a normal military environment, away from special operations, as part of what appears to be a psychological recovery process. The explanation added new dimensions to Maria's behavior since arriving at Camp Resolute. Her tolerance for harassment, her reluctance to demonstrate her capabilities, her preference for remaining invisible within the unit structure all reflected someone who was attempting to escape from a level of military service that had apparently taken a significant psychological toll. But the day's events had made it impossible for Maria to maintain her anonymity. Her rescue of Staff Sergeant Collins had revealed abilities that couldn't be explained through conventional training, forcing her to choose between maintaining her cover and saving the life of a fellow Marine. In the base medical facility, Collins was recovering from surgery to repair the arterial damage that would have proven fatal without Maria's immediate intervention. The attending physician, Navy Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, had reviewed Collins' medical records and was struggling to understand how he had survived blood loss that should have resulted in death within minutes of the initial injury. The tourniquet application was perfect, Dr. Mitchell told the medical staff who had participated in Collins' treatment. Professional-level trauma care administered under combat conditions by someone who clearly understood advanced emergency medicine. Whoever treated this patient saved his life through techniques that most field medics wouldn't have known to apply. Collins himself was experiencing a transformation in understanding that went beyond gratitude for his rescue. During his conscious moments, He was reviewing every interaction he had shared with Maria, recognizing signs that he had missed, clues that should have indicated her exceptional background and capabilities. "I need to see Rodriguez," Collins told Dr. Mitchell during one of his evaluation sessions. "There are things I need to say, things the whole unit needs to understand about what happened today." But Maria was not available for such conversations. Following her debriefing with Colonel Webb, she had been placed in restricted quarters while military intelligence specialists continued their investigation into her background and the implications of her revealed capabilities for base security and operational planning. The isolation was creating additional speculation among the Marines who had witnessed her performance. Some theorized that she was being debriefed about enemy capabilities or tactical intelligence gathered during the rescue operation. Others suspected that her background investigation had revealed security concerns that required special handling. Private Morrison, the youngest member of the patrol, had become an unofficial spokesperson for those who wanted to express appreciation for Maria's actions. "She saved Collins' life," he told anyone willing to listen. "Whatever her background is, whatever secrets she's keeping, she risked everything to bring him home. That's what matters." The sentiment was gaining support throughout the base as word of the rescue continued to spread. Marines who had never spoken to Maria were now defending her against any remaining skepticism, creating a protective atmosphere that would have seemed impossible during her first weeks at Camp Resolute. But the most significant transformation was occurring among the Marines who had directly participated in the harassment that had defined Maria's early experience at the base. They were beginning to understand that their behavior had not only been wrong, but had potentially compromised unit effectiveness by failing to recognize and properly utilize exceptional capabilities that were now desperately needed for future operations. The revelation that their supposed weakest member was actually their most qualified operative was forcing a comprehensive reevaluation of assumptions, procedures, and leadership practices that would have implications extending far beyond their remote Afghan outpost. 3 days after the rescue operation, Colonel Webb convened an unprecedented all-hands meeting in the base's primary briefing amphitheater, a concrete structure that normally housed routine operational briefings, but now buzzed with speculation about the extraordinary events that had shaken Camp Resolute's established order. Word of Maria Rodriguez's performance had spread through official and unofficial channels to every corner of the installation, creating conversations that challenged fundamental assumptions about personnel, assessment, and military capability evaluation. Amphitheater filled with Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen who represented every unit stationed at the remote outpost. Combat veterans with multiple deployments sat alongside newly arrived personnel. Senior officers occupied front-row seating near enlisted Marines who had witnessed the rescue firsthand, and support staff who rarely attended tactical briefings, crowded into available spaces to hear what promised to be a historic address. Colonel Webb took the podium with the bearing of a career officer who understood that his next words would influence military culture far beyond the boundaries of their Afghan installation. Behind him, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of the terrain where Maria had carried Staff Sergeant Collins to safety, with distance markers that emphasized the magnitude of her achievement for those who hadn't fully grasped the physical impossibility of what they had witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's sound system. 3 days ago, this installation experienced an event that has forced us to examine some of our most basic assumptions about human capability, personnel evaluation, and the dangers of judging individuals based on superficial characteristics rather than actual qualifications. The Colonel's opening remarks immediately established that the briefing would address issues extending far beyond the tactical details of a single rescue operation. He was acknowledging that Maria's performance had revealed systemic problems with how military personnel were assessed, assigned, and integrated into operational units, Webb continued by presenting a detailed analysis of the ambush that had nearly claimed Collins' life, using tactical graphics to illustrate how enemy forces had exploited intelligence gaps and positioning errors that should have been detected by more experienced personnel. The presentation methodically demonstrated that conventional military wisdom had failed at multiple levels, while the unit's supposedly least qualified member had provided the situational awareness and tactical expertise that ultimately prevented a catastrophic outcome. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez detected enemy preparations that our standard reconnaissance procedures missed. Webb explained, highlighting specific examples of Maria's observations that had gone unheeded by her fellow Marines. Her warnings about potential ambush sites were dismissed because we had already decided that her inexperience made her input unreliable. That decision nearly cost us a good Marine's life. The Colonel's assessment struck directly at the heart of military leadership principles that emphasize the importance of listening to subordinates, regardless of rank or apparent experience level. He was essentially acknowledging that the base's leadership structure had failed to recognize and utilize available intelligence because it had originated from someone they had prejudged as incompetent. Major Patricia Williams, the base's personnel officer, stepped forward to present findings from the comprehensive investigation into Maria's background and qualifications. The information she revealed would fundamentally alter how every person in the amphitheater understood talent recognition and operational security within military organizations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's official service record represents standard cover documentation for personnel involved in classified operations. Williams announced, her words causing immediate murmurs throughout the assembled audience. Her actual training includes advanced combat medicine, special operations tactics, survival and evasion techniques, and counterintelligence, methods that qualify her as one of the most capable operatives currently serving in this theater. The revelation that Maria had been hiding extraordinary qualifications rather than compensating for deficiencies created a collective sense of embarrassment among Marines who had spent months questioning her suitability for basic military service. They were learning that their harassment had been directed at someone whose capabilities exceeded their own by margins they were only beginning to comprehend. Williams continued by presenting specific examples of Maria's actual service history, including operations that had been critical to American strategic objectives but were classified at levels that prevented detailed discussion. The sanitized summaries she could provide painted a picture of someone whose military experience included situations that would have challenged the most elite special operations personnel. The rescue operation we witnessed was not an exceptional performance for Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Williams explained. It was a routine application of skills she has been developing and utilizing for years in operational environments that most of us will never experience. The statement reframed Maria's heroic rescue as merely typical behavior for someone with her actual background, emphasizing how completely the base personnel had misunderstood both her capabilities and her character. She hadn't been trying to prove herself during the evacuation. She had simply been doing what her training and experience had prepared her to do. Colonel Webb resumed the briefing by announcing immediate policy changes that would affect personnel, evaluation procedures throughout the installation, and potentially serve as a model for broader military implementation. The changes represented direct responses to the failures in judgment and leadership that had nearly resulted in tragedy. Effective immediately, all personnel assessments will include mandatory reviews by multiple evaluators from different backgrounds and experience levels, Webb announced. No individual will be marginalized or dismissed based on apparent physical characteristics, unofficial reputation, or assumptions about their background without comprehensive evaluation of their actual demonstrated capabilities. The new protocols represented a fundamental shift from traditional military assessment procedures that relied heavily on first impressions, physical appearance, and official documentation. The changes acknowledged that exceptional capability could be concealed by operational security requirements, personal preferences, or deliberate efforts to avoid attention. Additional policy modifications addressed training opportunities, leadership, development, and unit integration procedures that would prevent future repetitions of the systematic exclusion that Maria had experienced. The base would implement mentorship programs, cross-training initiatives, and regular capability assessments designed to identify and utilize talent regardless of its source or presentation. Master Sergeant Thompson, who had previously defended Maria's inclusion in patrol operations despite personal doubts about her qualifications, stood to address the assembled personnel about lessons learned from recent events. His remarks carried particular weight because of his reputation as a practical leader who based decisions on evidence rather than sentiment. "I want everyone to understand something," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with the authority earned through decades of combat leadership. Rodriguez didn't reveal her capabilities to show off or to embarrass anyone. She kept quiet about her background because operational security required it, and because she was trying to serve in a normal unit environment after assignments that most of us can't imagine. Thompson's assessment highlighted Maria's character as much as her capabilities, emphasizing that her tolerance for harassment and her preference for anonymity reflected professional discipline rather than weakness or insecurity. She had been protecting information that was more important than her personal comfort, demonstrating commitment to mission requirements, even when those requirements created personal hardship. The briefing concluded with announcements about expanded training opportunities that would be available to all base personnel, regardless of rank or official specialization. The programs would include advanced medical training, tactical movement techniques, and leadership development courses designed to maximize individual potential while improving overall unit effectiveness. But the most significant impact of the briefing was psychological rather than procedural. Every person in the amphitheater left with a fundamentally altered understanding of how to evaluate their fellow service members, how to recognize hidden capabilities, and how to avoid the prejudgments that had nearly resulted in tragedy. Word of the events at Camp Resolute began spreading through military communication networks to other installations throughout Afghanistan and beyond. The story of Maria Rodriguez became a case study in personnel management, leadership failure, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to identify exceptional capability. Training commands incorporated the incident into their curricula as an example of how assumptions based on physical characteristics could compromise operational effectiveness. Leadership schools used Maria's experience to illustrate the importance of creating environments where all personnel could contribute to their maximum potential without fear of discrimination or marginalization. The transformation at Camp Resolute continued as Marines who had participated in harassing Maria began approaching her with apologies that went far beyond simple acknowledgments of error. They were recognizing that their behavior had been fundamentally wrong, not just because they had misjudged her capabilities, but because they had created a hostile environment that could have prevented her from utilizing those capabilities when lives depended on them. The cultural shift represented more than policy changes or procedural modifications. It reflected a fundamental evolution in how military personnel understood talent recognition, inclusive leadership, and the dangers of allowing preconceptions to override evidence-based assessment of individual capability and character. 6 months later, Camp Resolute had become an unlikely destination for military observers from around the world who came to study what was being called the Rodriguez Protocol, a comprehensive approach to personnel evaluation that prioritized demonstrated capability over superficial assessments. The remote Afghan outpost that had once represented routine counterinsurgency operations was now pioneering military culture reforms that were being implemented across multiple services and allied nations. Maria Rodriguez had accepted promotion to gunnery sergeant, and assumed responsibilities for training advanced tactical medicine and crisis response procedures throughout the regional command. Her classes were consistently oversubscribed, with Marines traveling from other installations, specifically to learn techniques that had been refined through experiences she still couldn't discuss in detail due to security classifications. Training sessions she conducted bore no resemblance to traditional military instruction. Rather than demonstrating techniques through dominance or physical superiority, Maria taught efficiency, precision, and the intelligent application of limited resources to achieve maximum effect. Her students learned that true capability often resided in understanding physics, anatomy, and tactical principles rather than relying solely on strength or conventional approaches. Violence should always be the last option, Maria explained during one of her medical training sessions, but when it becomes necessary, it should be swift, precise, and effective. The goal is to preserve life, not to prove superiority. Her philosophy represented a fundamental departure from military cultures that emphasized aggression and physical dominance over strategic thinking and measured response. Staff Sergeant Collins, who had made a complete recovery from his wounds, became one of Maria's most vocal advocates within the military establishment. His perspective carried particular weight because he had experienced firsthand both the consequences of underestimating exceptional capability and the life-saving benefits of recognizing it when circumstances demanded action. "Rodriguez saved my life," Collins told a visiting delegation of senior officers from Pentagon headquarters. "But more importantly, she taught all of us that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize immediately. The strongest person in our unit was someone we had dismissed as the weakest, and that's a lesson that applies far beyond military service." Collins had become instrumental in documenting and disseminating the changes that had occurred at Camp Resolute following Maria's revelation. His testimony provided credible witness accounts that helped convince skeptical officials that the cultural transformation they were observing represented genuine improvement rather than temporary adjustment to extraordinary circumstances. The base's overall performance metrics supported Collins' assessment. Injury rates during training and operations had decreased by 40% as Marines learned to rely on technique and preparation rather than brute force approaches. Mission effectiveness improved as personnel began contributing insights and capabilities that had previously been overlooked or dismissed due to assumptions about rank, experience, or physical characteristics. Lieutenant Morrison, who had led the patrol during the ambush, received early promotion to captain and was assigned to develop new training protocols based on lessons learned from the Rodriguez incident. His curriculum included mandatory instruction on recognizing concealed capabilities, creating inclusive unit environments, and avoiding the cognitive biases that could compromise operational effectiveness. "We failed Rodriguez for months before she saved Collins," Morrison explained to officer candidates during leadership seminars. "Our failure wasn't just morally wrong, it was tactically dangerous. We had our most capable asset, and we treated her like a liability because we couldn't see past our own preconceptions." Morrison's honest assessment of leadership failures resonated with military audiences who were beginning to understand that inclusive practices represented operational advantages rather than political correctness. Units that effectively identified and utilized all available talent consistently outperformed those that relied on traditional hierarchies and assumption-based evaluations. The cultural changes extended beyond tactical improvements to affect fundamental aspects of military life and relationships. Marines who had previously bonded through shared mockery of perceived weakness began building connections based on mutual respect and recognition of diverse strengths. The environment became one where individuals felt safe contributing their unique capabilities without fear of ridicule or marginalization. Corporal Hayes, who had initiated much of the early harassment directed at Maria, underwent the most dramatic personal transformation. He requested transfer to military police duties specifically, so he could work to prevent discrimination and create more inclusive environments within military installations. His conversion from antagonist to advocate became a powerful example of how exposure to genuine capability could fundamentally alter individual perspectives and priorities. I was wrong about Rodriguez, Hayes admitted during a base-wide ceremony recognizing Maria's contributions to unit effectiveness and military culture reform. But more than that, I was wrong about what strength looks like, what capability means, and what it takes to serve effectively in today's military. She taught me to look deeper, to question my assumptions, and to recognize that the quiet ones often have the most to offer. Hayes' public acknowledgement of this transformation inspired similar admissions from other Marines who had participated in marginalizing Maria. Their testimonials created a cascading effect that encouraged honest self-examination and genuine commitment to cultural change throughout the installation. The story of Maria Rodriguez began appearing in military professional journals, leadership textbooks, and training materials used throughout American and Allied armed forces. Her experience became a case study in personnel management, organizational psychology, and the practical benefits of inclusive leadership practices in high-stakes operational environments. Academic, researchers from military colleges and civilian universities requested access to Camp Resolute to study the transformation that had occurred following Maria's revelation. Their findings supported broader theories about hidden talent, unconscious bias, and the organizational conditions that either unleash or suppress individual potential. Dr. Jennifer Matthews from the Naval War College published a comprehensive analysis titled "Recognizing Hidden Strength: Lessons from Afghanistan" that used Maria's experience to illustrate how military organizations could improve effectiveness by creating environments where all personnel could contribute to their maximum potential regardless of appearance, background, or unofficial reputation. The Rodriguez case demonstrates that exceptional capability often conceals itself behind ordinary appearances. Dr. Matthews wrote, "Organizations that learn to identify and nurture hidden strengths will consistently outperform those that rely on superficial assessments and traditional assumptions about talent and leadership." The broader impact extended beyond military circles to corporate training programs, educational institutions, and community organizations that recognize the universal applicability of lessons learned at Camp Resolute. Maria's story became a touchstone for discussions about diversity, inclusion, and the practical benefits of looking beyond surface characteristics to identify genuine capability and character. Maria herself remained characteristically humble about the attention her actions had generated. When asked about the widespread impact of her rescue of Collins, she consistently redirected conversations toward broader principles rather than personal recognition. Every organization has people whose capabilities exceed their official roles, Maria explained during an interview with military media representatives. The key is creating environments where those people feel safe demonstrating what they can do when circumstances require it. Collins needed help, and I was able to provide it. That's what service members do for each other. Her response reflected the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout her time at Camp Resolute, but now it was recognized as evidence of strength rather than dismissed as inadequacy. The transformation in perception represented a fundamental shift in how military culture understood and valued different expressions of capability and leadership. Years later, the Rodriguez Protocol would be implemented throughout American military services and adopted by allied nations seeking to maximize their human resource potential. Training centers would display photographs of Maria carrying Collins across Afghan terrain as reminders that strength comes in many forms and that assumptions about capability based on appearance could have deadly consequences. But perhaps the Most significant legacy was the countless individual transformations that occurred as military personnel learned to look beyond superficial characteristics to recognize the hidden strengths that exist in every organization. Maria Rodriguez had saved one Marine's life through extraordinary physical performance, but her greater contribution was teaching an entire military culture to see capability where it actually existed rather than where they expected to find it. The lesson resonated far beyond military service to every workplace, community, and relationship where people made assumptions about others based on appearance rather than taking the time to discover the remarkable capabilities that often hide behind the most ordinary exteriors. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one everyone assumes is the weakest, and recognizing that truth can literally mean the difference between life and death. In a world full of assumptions and superficial judgments, Maria Rodriguez proved that authentic strength reveals itself not through dominance or display, but through quiet competence and willingness to act when action is needed most. Her story continues to inspire people to look deeper, judge less, and recognize that extraordinary capability often wears the most humble disguise. Today, Gunnery Sergeant Maria Rodriguez serves as the Marine Corps' lead instructor for crisis response and advanced tactical medicine at Quantico, Virginia. Her training methods have been adopted by special operations forces worldwide, and the Rodriguez Protocol is now standard curriculum at military academies across 5 continents. But Maria's greatest pride isn't in the protocols, promotions, or recognition. It's in the letters she receives from Marines who learn to see strength in unexpected places, who stopped judging their teammates by appearance, and who created inclusive environments where hidden talents could flourish. Staff Sergeant Collins, now a Master Sergeant, keeps a photograph on his desk, not of his own awards or achievements, but of a small woman carrying a massive Marine across 5 miles of hostile terrain. When young Marines ask about it, he tells them the same story. Never assume you know someone's capabilities based on what you see on the surface. The lesson extends far beyond military service. In corporate boardrooms, school classrooms, and community centers around the world, people remember the story of Maria Rodriguez when they're tempted to dismiss someone as too small, too quiet, or too different to make a meaningful contribution. Her legacy lives in every moment when someone chooses to look deeper instead of judging quickly, when leaders create space for unexpected voices, and when communities recognize that their greatest assets might be hiding in plain sight. Maria Rodriguez proved that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person everyone needs most. She reminds us that authentic strength doesn't announce itself with noise and spectacle. It reveals itself through quiet competence and willingness to act when others need help most. Have you ever underestimated someone who surprised you? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story changed how you see the people around you, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest voices.